So as an introduction, then, as I said, Nick is an ISA certified arborist. Bartlett Tree Service is originally out of Grand Rapids. They're also moving into the Kalamazoo area, and he has agreed to give us a talk on why we want a tree canopy, the type of trees we should be looking at. They themselves do not plant trees, they maintain trees. So he can also talk to us once they're planted, how do we maintain them so that they don't die in the first couple of years or be eaten by the deer, which we have so many of, you know. So I will now hand it over to Nick for the next 25 minutes, and then we can have as many questions as people have.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so working with trees in the urban environment, it's a very stressed environment for trees to begin with. All the infrastructure we build around these trees when naturally um, through evolution, they grew up in forests, in different habitats. They didn't evolve to be next to houses, next to roads, have their root systems destroyed, being compacted, poor soils that were stripped just because we want to build buildings. Um, so but the importance of having the trees is so great. They essentially are like nature's air conditioning. They sequester carbon in the atmosphere, release tons of oxygen for us to breathe, and make a habitat, bridge habitats for birds, mammals, insects. And if we take those trees away, not only are we going to be contributing to habitat loss, a rise in carbon dioxide, uh, water management, but we'll also end up building what's called a heat island effect. And essentially, a heat island is creating a like a microclimate, especially around a lot of hard surfaces, buildings, asphalt, concrete, rock landscapes. And essentially, what happens is trees reflect a lot of that heat energy. As they transpire, they're actually cooling the air around them. And when you take that away, the shade, that transpiration, the sun will be on those hard surfaces and they absorb the heat and they cook. It's just essentially like grass. Grass is air conditioning itself. You walk on grass barefoot on a hot, sunny day, you don't mind walking on it. But as soon as you step off the grass onto a hot, black top pavement, you're going to probably step right back into the grass because it's going to hurt. But if you think about that, those surfaces, they're actually warming up the air around them. They're creating a microenvironment. And in those environments, you have a fluctuation of the ecology. And ultimately, it's almost like a negative feedback loop. If you have a large enough area, everybody's going to want to turn on their air conditioning to survive that heat. And that just ends up using more energy, more fossil fuels are being used, more carbon dioxide, greenhouse effect, and it just kind of ramps it up. So how do we kind of backtrack a little bit? Well, if you plant a tree, you shade out that area, you're going to start lowering the temperatures. The tree can also shade buildings, that actually creates a bunch of energy savings. And ultimately, it really runs down to I studied landscape design, horticultural science at Michigan State University, got my bachelor degree. And one of the key concepts, there's two key concepts that's really important to this topic. It is form follows function. What's the function of these trees? Habitat, energy savings, creating a better, cooler environment, carbon sequestration, oxygen. There's so many functions of these trees. So it's not necessarily about the look, it's the function. What is that tree doing? And then we start considering the tree. And when it what tree it is, well, we always also have the saying, right plant, right place. Not every tree is going to work where they might be planted. You may have a wonderful idea. It's like, yes, let's plant an oak tree. It looks so cute, 5 feet away from the house. Well, guess what? When that oak tree gets really large, it's going to be trying to grow in the house. If it's growing over the deck, it'll be raining acorns, and you'll be thinking like 15, 20, 30 years, why did I plant that? So right plant, right place. And in these areas where trees are removed, we got to consider, well, what trees were there? What trees worked there? Um, Especially along streets, there's only so many trees that can really handle that stress. Um, the emissions from cars, the periods of drought, um, and essentially another important factor is when I say stress trees in urban environments, one of the most common practices that we do to keep up with the parents is we remove the leaves from the canopy, or not from the canopy, from the ground when the leaves fall in the fall. Well, in the forest setting, when those leaves fall to the ground, they restore nutrients to the soil, they add organic content, make a habitat in the ground for invertebrates, microbes, and that all comes together and benefit the trees. In the urban environment where this construction's happening, that's all stripped away. It's just backfilled. And ultimately, the leaves that come off these trees are going to probably be swept away. Not all of it's going to get restored into that root zone of the tree. But the trees that we choose are going to be a bit more tolerant of it. The way we maintain these trees are going to make these trees more successful. Granted, trees are smart. They will learn to adapt to a degree. So there is a right approach, several right approaches, several wrong approaches. So I'll cover those as best I can. So when selecting a tree, there's a lot of trees out there, like ginkgo trees, um, columnar oaks. We moved away from elms, but there's hybrid elms, Chinese elms, lindens, zelkova, honey locust. There's several maples that work really great as street trees. I am staying away from Norway maples. Some areas are finding those to be a little bit invasive. Sweet gum trees. Bradford pears used to be a huge recommendation, but I am also going to be recommending against those just because they tend to have really poor structure. And there are areas that are giving away trees if you remove pears because they're also invasive. So again, right plant, right place, do your research. When there's infrastructure, in most cases, these trees will be a bit more shallowly rooted. However, as long as the infrastructure is sound, these trees aren't going to negatively impact those underground pipes, conduit. If anything, it's if you get access to those, these trees are going to probably be removed. And I had an agreement with my property. I had a water main near the street. I got rid of my pears, but I got in contact with the road commission and said, hey, I'm going to replant trees. And they told me, are you sure there's going to be a water main? I'm like, absolutely. Well, if we have to access that water main, we'll have to remove it. Doesn't matter to me because I know the benefit of those trees. Yes, they may get removed, but I will replant because the benefit of them being there outweighs the thought of I might lose them one day. Um, and when after planting those trees, we have well, let's think about the planting concepts. Let's set up these trees for success. Um, there are a lot of practices out there that lead to tree failures, but to really plant the tree in the right possible way, we want to start off trees by making sure what's called the root flare of the tree is above the soil surface. A lot of times in nurseries, occasionally landscapers, homeowners, they'll dig a deep hole, drop the tree in, that root flare gets buried several feet under. And where the root flare is where the stem tissue turns into root tissue. Why that is important that that isn't buried is because roots actually use oxygen. Trees, they respirate just like you and me. We breathe in oxygen and we use that oxygen to break up sugars and use energies. Trees do the same thing. However, they also offset that with their photosynthesis. There's two processes going on. So the tree isn't directly using the sun's energy as energy. It has to respirate. So underground, those roots, they don't have sun to photosynthesize. They're using sugars from the canopy that comes down, and they too need oxygen. So if we bury those root systems, we bury that root flare, those roots are going to be confused. Those are going to be stress trees. We need to make sure that those roots are able to breathe. So planting at the right depth is critical for a really healthy tree. Doing that reduces stress, and a less stressed tree is going to be a lot more, how do you say, resistant to pests and diseases. Pests and diseases, they're going to attack stress trees because they have weakened cells. They're easier to attack. So let's reduce distress. Another thing that's going to help reduce stress, especially in those urban environments, mulch. A lot of trees are planted and they just throw grass around it and it's good. There are, I always hand out mulching guidelines to all my clients whenever I see grass right around trees. Mulch has so many benefits, just in, like in the forest with the leaves breaking down in the soil. The mulch is going to add organic content to what's probably stripped soil. It's going to invite microbes, invertebrates that break down that mulch over time to that's going to condition the soil and ultimately feed the tree. It's going to help retain soil moisture, which is critical because they might not always get water. And on top of that, they're going to a degree, help cool the soil. If you have bare soil, the root system will get big, the tree will get stressed out. So the mulch is kind of like the first defense. Also, if you have grass up to a tree, our lawn grasses are extremely competitive with trees, especially when they're younger. So they're going to actually pull nutrients and water away from the tree that the tree could use to grow up and survive. So if we remove the grass from the root zone of those trees, it's no longer in competition. That's what mulch is going to do. The other thing happens is when grass grows up to trees. Well, how do we mow around the trees without harming the trunk? On the outside of the tree is where most of the active plumbing is on a tree. You use a string trimmer, you accidentally knock the lawnmower, you're going to damage that outside and you're going to affect the plumbing of the tree, and you're going to see that up in the canopy. You're going to make it harder for it to move the water and nutrients up the canopy so it can get the energy it needs for all the other functions, including the roots. So mulch is probably the best thing I can recommend for any tree out there. And there's in large planting projects, you can get mulch virtually for free by contacting an arborist. We're always looking, we have fresh wood chips all the time, and a lot of it. So mulch is, again, the best way to recycle wood and create benefit for your trees. Also with planting, I recommend, soil moisture is very important. I recommend planting usually in the fall or spring. Soil moisture is good, roots are growing out. I don't recommend fertilizing the first year or two. And the reason why is, yes, we need to make sure soil moisture is good so the tree can transpire, do what it needs to do. But if we fertilize, we're going to be conditioning the roots to keep growing where the fertilizer is being applied when we really want the roots to grow out. Trees, as I mentioned earlier, they're a little smart. Their roots are going to swell up where there are ample nutrients, ample water, ample air. And that's also why I recommend don't throw in a bunch of amendments into the soil unless you're going to get a large area of the root zone. If you're making a tiny hole, try to keep it the same soil, because you want the tree to recognize that this is the soil I'm in, and I'm going to need to root out more to get more. But if you have conditioned soil, well fertilized soil right next to the tree, guess what? Those roots are going to stay there, and they're never going to fully go out and establish as well as you want it to be. The tree is being babied. We want the tree to adapt to where it's at. We want the tree to essentially the saying, if you feed a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man to fish, he eats for life. That's what we're going to be doing with these trees. A couple of years after you start rooting it out, if you're trying to get growth, or you notice deficiencies in the soil, that's when you start fertilizing. Unless there's a severe deficiency or pH imbalance from whatever's being dumped to fill that area, just run a soil test. If it needs to be addressed, address it, but make sure you get the whole root zone, not just where it's getting planted. Other care is a lot of trees when they come from the nursery are thin barked. So usually the first couple years, wrap the bark with like a white paper. Some places paint, but I like the paper because you can remove it. And the reason why that's important is in the winter, we have freezing and thawing. Well, the sap on that active plumbing on the outside, if the sun is beating on it, especially we call it southwest canker because it's usually the southwest side of the sun that gets hottest in winter. The sap will expand to the point where it cracks open the bark. By having a white paper reflect the light off, that doesn't happen as likely, because if that splits open the bark, causes damage, plumbing's ruptured, the trees usually recover, but it slows them down. So that's a recommendation, especially with maples. And you can usually also get guards that help with that, and also help with what's called buck rub. As you mentioned, there's deer. Deer will use small trees on their horns, and you can tell because you'll see a lot of vertical lines on smaller trees where they're doing it to get, I think it's called the velvet, off their horns. When they're hormonal, they'll also just do it. It's just like scratching an it or marking their territory. I'm not animal behaviorist, but I know it happens. This is how we would prevent it. Let's see. Staking. If trees need to be staked, only stake them for a year. I've seen it way too many times and you want them staked so the tree has some movement, because when the tree is moving, it is flexing, and when it flexes, it adapts to with the wind. So if you have a tree that's stiff, with what being staked or guide, the tree isn't going to flex, it's not going to adapt. Trees are smart, they'll stiffen up as the wind blows it. And it's going to make them more likely to resist strong windstorms. There's a lot of storms that blow through Kalamazoo. I'm watching the radar all the time. And those stakes, again, only 1 year. I see it a lot where the ropes, the metal stakes, even with large diameter ropes or things that protect the bark, if they're left there too long, it creates girdling damage. It chokes out the outside of the tree where that plumbing is active. And I've seen so bad above every part of the canopy above the point where it was staked died, because the tree continues to grow And if those aren't removed or at least moved, it will choke out the plumbing to the point that it doesn't work anymore. And the tree's not going to adapt to it. So 1 year, cut it out of there, let the tree be a tree. And maintenance care as the tree grows, you may need to fertilize if a lot of the leaves are being removed. But if you keep the tree healthy, as stress free as possible, you have a drought, run a hose, do a small trickle, let it run for 30 minutes to an hour. To water it during periods of drought. Trees will take on a lot of water. Granted, when they're smaller, we do just want to make sure the soil is moist. And one of the critical concepts when it comes to soil moisture that I see is mistaken a lot, especially with houseplants. If anybody's overwatered a houseplant, it's very hard to tell because the symptoms of overwatering and underwatering look the same. Wilty plant, because you're starving the roots of oxygen, which they need, and you're causing root rot. So how do you check for proper soil moisture? It's a lot less than people think. You dig a couple inches down below the soil. If you feel any moisture, the tree has water. A lot of people think that with young trees, the soil needs to be absolutely saturated. Well, if you're able to pick up the soil, squeeze it in your hand and get water droplets out, that's too much. If you're able to squeeze out water droplets, that means that the air space in that soil is being taken up by water, because soil needs to have three components: the minerals that help hold the nutrients, the pore space that hold the water, and the pore space that holds the air. So the minerals, the air, and the water, all three of those are very important soil. If it's too wet, the water overplaces the air. So again, soil moisture is key. A lot of new plants, we wanna baby them. We really want to give them so much love, houseplants included. But too much love, one, doesn't allow the tree to adapt, as I mentioned before. But two, will actually could kill the tree because the roots can't breathe. Um, I think that covers most of the care, most of the planting. So I guess now would be a good time for questions. Wouldn't you agree?
Okay. Anybody have any questions right now? Jennifer, you have a question?
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any mulch chip or any type of tree wood in chip form that would be a no-no as a mulch. Like, are there certain tree species where the certain type of mulch would clash with a different kind of tree? I'm asking mostly because I'm going to have some trees chopped down in my backyard, and that seems like a good source of free mulch, but I don't want to misuse.
Absolutely. No, that is, and I'm actually really glad you asked that question, because yes, there are trees out there that have these phytotoxic compounds, is what they're called. The most notable one in Michigan is called black walnut. It has a phytotoxic compound called juglone. And these trees use these compounds to essentially reduce the competition of trees around them. They're smart. They want to grow, so they're going to try and wipe out the competition. Well, it is in all parts of the plant. And when it's in the soil, it can be in there for decades. And there's only so many trees that are listed as tolerant to this juglone. And that list is available on one of our partners, the Morton Arboretum. They have a website, and you can look up walnut tolerant species, and it'll give you a list, because you might consider using that mulch if you want weed-free mulch. But you need to make sure that those trees are tolerant. Otherwise, you're going to start seeing a decline of trees. So my general recommendation is just don't use the mulch, because ultimately, if you don't know, or if you have a stress tree, it is going to respond negatively. Out in California, the redwoods also have a phytotoxic compound, but mainly in Michigan, it's really just black walnut we're worried about. Most other hardwood species are great source of chips. You can use softwood too, but the hardwood ones last just a little bit longer.
And even if the tree was diseased, like the trees I'm taking down are dead or dying. So does that?
So that's another great question. If the tree, there are various diseases that you would want to avoid the mulch from. Verticillium wilt in maples. If you are planting trees that are, or shrubs that are susceptible to verticillium wilt, don't use that mulch. Oak trees, if it has oak wilt and that's why they're coming down, I wouldn't use that mulch, at least if there is other oaks in the area that you're trying to save, because we want it out of the soil. And I think those are the biggest two. Oh, and elms, if it has Dutch elm disease, a lot of these vascular disease is really what I'm trying to get at. We don't want to use anything that has a vascular disease. And there are a few, essentially, if you are removing a tree, more often than not, if you're going to be replanting the same species of tree in that wood mulch, then it would be a bad idea unless that wood mulch is adequately kiln dried or processed, which is if you're getting it from an arborist or it's being freshly chipped, that's not happening. So that disease or those pests and those affected trees are still going to probably be there. So it's fine if you're not worried about the other same species in the area. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Of course.
Laura, you had a question?
Yeah. I got two questions and then kind of one observation. So with the mulching around the base of the trees, I've heard it's not good to like mound it too high. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how deep above the ground level, is a good recommendation.
That's a wonderful question. And you're absolutely right. What you heard is, yes, you don't want to mound it. We call them mulch volcanoes. And I have a professor that essentially threatened everybody that if you make a mulch volcano, I will find you and make an example of you. And I do a lot of work that rectifies what those mulch volcanoes do. Because what happens is, as I mentioned earlier in my chat, when you're planting these trees, you want what's called that root flare above the soil surface. So that root flare, if you're mounding soil above it, it's buried. And that mulch breaks down and turns into a nice, rich, organic soil that hopefully gets intermixed with the soil below. But still, it's above, it breaks down, it creates moisture that's trapped up there. And ultimately, if the roots can't breathe, they're going to start coming out higher on the stem and they'll start wrapping the tree and create what's called girdling roots. Just like those tree guys I mentioned, it will start girdling down there. And there's plenty of examples of how those trees looked. I even seen images where trees have snapped right down there where they're girdled from the roots in windstorms. And the best way to prevent that is if you're applying mulch, 2 to 4 inches is recommended. And just keep an inch away, roughly a half inch away from that root flare. And you're not mounding it. Over time, you may want to replace it or make the mulching larger. There's a whole bunch of guidelines out there for mulching, but that is the most important thing, is just don't mound it over the root flare. Does that answer your question? Or at least your first one?
Yeah, that helps. So we've got like 5 acres here. We're in between Holland, Saugatuck area, and uh, probably at least 2/3, 3/4 of our property is a mixture of oak and white pine. But around the house, 30 years ago, we put in, yard, and we were young and dumber, and we planted, I think we've got about a total of 7 Norway maples that are in various places around the house. And I'm just kind of wondering, I mean, you say they're invasive, but should we think about removing them, or if they're doing okay? Are they causing any, ecological problem or?
So the best way to tell if they are being invasive is you have 5 acres. If you notice young maple saplings growing in places they shouldn't, essentially a weed is considered anything that is growing where it's not desired. So if you have Norway maples trying to grow in, if you have rocks somewhere, if you have a forest setting and you're just seeing a lot of young maple saplings, well, chances are the seeds are coming from your trees. While it doesn't necessarily mean you have to remove those trees, they're not incredibly invasive like the other species we have, like buckthorn, Russian olive, honeysuckles. Those ones are crazy invasive, but a lot of the seeds from these maples generally helicopter down to the ground below. And when you mow the grass, or you're clipping off what's called the cotyledons or the early leaves. And that's essentially the energy that they need to keep going. So if you clip those a couple times, it naturally resolves itself. It's just when those get away from us that you're going to start seeing it more in the forest, which that's where they're not native to. And, we want more of the native maples that are native ecological pests, or not pests, insects, birds, mammals are used to. So that's what, when you become concerned with invasive. Right now, we're not at a point where it's say, oh, Norway maple, cut it down. No, we still will maintain them. I just personally wouldn't plant anymore.
Right, definitely. Last thing, we live fairly close to the lake shore. I don't know, we're about a mile in, and I don't know if they've been doing this over by Kalamazoo as extensively, but just Consumers Energy with the tree trimming, just massive swaths of trees taken out. And I have great concern because they're cutting down all these and trimming all these oak trees during that season when you're not supposed to trim, I thought, oak trees. And it isn't Consumers Energy supposed to follow those guidelines?
So Consumers Energy, usually those are subcontracted out, and there's various subcontractors. Now, granted, I'm an ISA certified arborist. Just because you're an arborist doesn't necessarily mean you have that code of ethics, you have the training to be aware of that. And a lot of these contractors that come out to do line clearance, granted, they're trying to do better in the industry, but when it comes to cost, yep, cut it, get that line clear. Species, it's a tree, cut it. Now, granted, some of this is time sensitive. Some of them may be doing what's called painting their cuts. So they're putting a sealer over the cuts and it's black. If that's done if it's not,
No.
then yeah, they are opening up these trees to disease. And the only thing I can really say is if you spot it, call the company, call consumers and say, hey, I've witnessed this company doing line clearance and they're pruning oaks and they're not taking great caution. Granted, there are websites out there that are monitoring when it might be the risky to prune oaks. Our company doesn't like taking those risks. We'll just wait till it's dormant. But there are times in the season where you might be able to get away with pruning. I just won't ever recommend that because you never know. There's microclimates. You have to, you're just throwing the dice out there because once you have oak wilt, it'll spread through the root system. And if you know it, you'll know what it looks like. It's really sad.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Lou Marie.
Thank you. You mentioned at the beginning of the hour that you're engaging in a a tree planting event in response to the tornado.
Mm-hmm.
When you have opportunities to do something like that, where you're putting in a lot of new plantings, what are the species that you like to reach for in this area? Like what do you think the plan is for those hundreds of trees that are going in? Are they like white oaks, or what are some of the considerations?
So, I think essentially part of it is it's working with a landscape architect. And what the trees are going in, I would imagine are going to be native species. They're going to be a mix. Whenever you do a planting, generally you do want a nice healthy mix. Because if you plant all the same species, well, you get something that comes in that affects that one species, it's able to leapfrog very quick, which is another pro tip when it comes to planting is mix up your species. So the consideration is, I'm sure there's been somewhat of an inventory of what the trees are in those areas. There are resources available that say, hey, this is a X habitat. I forgot the name of it. But there is a book available that describes habitats and species of all plants that are found in those habitats. And that is a great guide to try to match up those species to try to restore that habitat. Granted, if it's a native environment, we're going to try to do native. If it's just along roadways, then the opportunities open up where it'd be nice to go native, but you have to also consider trees that are actually going to be able to tackle that stress. Does that kind of answer your question? Ultimately, with that project, I'm more there as an ISA certified arborist. And my goal is to mainly focus on the care of the trees, be able to make recommendations, but ultimately it ends up becoming with the relationship with the landscape architect and whoever is giving that grant out to make that happen. Absolutely.
You mentioned both oak and sweet gum. Now, I was reading an article that in a city, it was an article in New York City, where we are not New York City, but they were saying that having the oak and the sweet gum actually releases some sort of gas that when it interacts with car pollution is actually very bad for the air. Do you know anything about this, and should we be avoiding replanting sweet gums and oaks?
I'll be honest, I haven't heard of that. And it still is being recommended. It does make me wonder if maybe it's like an ethylene gas or an ozone gas. Any of those sound familiar?
The ozone, maybe.
Okay, because ozone is essentially it's created with car pollution, whether it's acting as a catalyst. I'm not entirely sure, but even if it's acting as a catalyst, it's more of where's the source coming from? It's coming from cars. So it really runs down to, well, how do we reduce the emissions from cars that ultimately gets catalyzed by these trees, so on and so forth. So just saying that the trees are the problem, I think is avoiding trying to solve the root of the problem, which is where the initial emissions are coming from, the cars. Yes, cars are important. They get us from point A to point B relatively fast. But why aren't we considering public transportation, carpooling, bike lanes? Because there's other ways for us to get point A to point B and doesn't involve us all riding solo in a car that's going to create more emissions. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, but unfortunately, at the rate we're going, I think cars are going to be around a long time. If we can plant trees that are compatible with cars, it
Yeah.
doesn't hurt us, and it might help people with asthma. That's all. Tim, you have a question?
I wonder if you could just briefly say a little bit about the business that you're with, the Bartlett Tree Service.
Yeah.
Where you're located, how do you operate, etc.
So we are Bartlett Tree Experts. We are one of the largest family-owned businesses in the US. Our corporate headquarters is in Connecticut, but we also have a 400-acre research laboratory in North Carolina. And we have 15 PhDs that study just trees and a swath of diagnosticians that will do soil tests. They'll take in samples, so we'll do testing for oak wilt, verticillium wilt, root rot, and ultimately trying to find solutions for our clients. So Bartlett Tree Experts is kind of like almost the one-stop shop tree care. Some offices do plantings, ours specifically in the Grand Rapids area, and Zeeland in Michigan. We don't really do too many tree plantings. Granted, we do some because we will do it the right possible way for the best possible outcome of these trees. But most of our services involve pruning trees, plant health care. While we are more focused with the preservation of trees, we do remove trees when it's necessary because sometimes that is plant health care. If you have a very infected tree and you need to reduce the spread of a pest or disease, yeah, maybe we need to remove it. But we try to avoid that if possible. We also do a lot of consulting work. So if you have a tree that you're on the fence of, is this tree safe or not? There's a cavity. Well, we have consultants that will climb the tree and use what's called a resistance drill to gauge out how much that canopy is and use science to tell you, is that cavity actually affecting the safety of this tree being next to your house or where your kids are playing? And also, if there is a risk involved, how can we mitigate? How can we lower that risk, whether it's shrinking the canopy or maybe removing a section of the tree or installing structural support to the tree? We do a lot of structural support such as cable systems. But yeah, a lot of our focus is our research lab is mainly focused on plant healthcare. So trying to help create trees that will outlive us in the urban environment, because it is very hard out there for trees, especially when a lot of us, we don't know much about trees. There's so much to be learned, and that's exactly what that research lab is going to do for us, is essentially give us the tools needed to educate our clients, help them make the best possible holistic decision for the longevity of the trees on their properties. But yes, we're mainly focused in Grand Rapids. My goal has been to get down to the Kalamazoo and Battle Creek market because I am meeting a lot of people down there that are starved of the tree services that we provide, and they are awesome to talk to because they are just like me, passionate about trees. And that's awesome. I'm passionate about being an arborist because we're touching those, and a lot of my colleagues are the same way. The plant healthcare specialists, the climbers, a lot of our climbers get ISA certifications. We all share this passion for working with these giants on our property. The essentially longest standing, largest part of our landscapes that has almost an overwhelming function compared to everything else that's green and growing. Trees.
I have an additional question, about the future. Okay, I'm looking down the road, but planting trees now for down the road.
Mhm.
We in Kalamazoo, we've in the last couple of years, we've had more tornadoes. We've had more. I forget what it's called, wind something where it breaks the
Oh,
trees.
straight line winds.
Right. And so I'm wondering, should we, as a canopy, because a canopy has to be a certain height. You don't want a 5-foot tree in a canopy. You want to be able to walk under it, if nothing
Mhm.
else. What would be an optimal height, or what should we be looking for in a species where we take into consideration we might not want very tall trees that are going to be falling in tornadoes and hitting buildings, or be cut off in half with these wind things. So, what would you recommend along those lines for the longevity of both climate change and tree growth?
I'll be honest with you, the sky's the limit. Really, what it runs down to is the right plant, right place. You're not going to plant a tall growing tree next to a power line, because just like those oaks that were probably improperly pruned earlier, they're going to get butchered. So you got to consider, where are these trees being planted? Now, yes, you have to be aware of straight line winds and all that. But here's the kicker to that. If you have trees create their own buffer in a forest setting, trees, they grow together, they're all act as a buffer. If you start removing trees in the forest and just leave a couple trees, well, guess what? They are not used to winds and they're prone to failing. So when you think about planting trees in an urban environment, stop treating it like individual trees. Start treating it like a forest, an urban forest. Because collectively, if you have a lot of the similar size trees, they're going to create a large buffer area. So it really runs down to trying to get the density right. So when the canopy grows up and wide, that the other, oh my goodness, the canopy is able to buffer a lot of those winds. And that may ultimately, I don't, this may be anecdotal, but I feel like in a lot of those areas, it might be able to break apart storms. I can't say because I'm not a meteorologist, but if you think about it, you're you're altering a microclimate, that heat island. So again, managing that urban forest, and trying to get the density right. You don't want to necessarily plant a really tall tree next to short trees because then it stands out. There's lightning strikes. But if you have a good tree cover, the sky is really the limit, I think.
Okay.
The right plant, right place.
Okay, so it's almost 1 o'clock. So Lou Marie, you can be the last question here so that we don't hold Nick beyond the 1 o'clock commitment.
Thank you. The entire time I've been here, I've been staring out, and I live right next to a whole bunch of power lines, and I'm staring at a large maple tree where the canopy is cut in half because of the power lines. So are you saying that cities, particularly like Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, are taking height into account now? Because it seems like, looking at all the trees in my area, at least, that it's mostly like these maple trees that are planted along the roadway. And you end up having to chop the canopy in these really unnatural ways to get them out of the way of the power lines. And so I'm just kind of wondering, has the practice of like what's being planted near power lines evolved, or Because I can understand like the urge to plant these big canopy trees, because who doesn't really love a maple, but it does kind of look really sad to see the canopy really like chopped in half.
So the answer to that is it's all over the board. There's so many differing opinions. There's different budgets. There's different companies that have different codes of ethics and so on and so forth. Again, not everyone's ISA certified and will make the right cuts, because yeah, you can prune around the power line in a way to try to train the tree, so you're not having to butcher the tree, but you have to time it right. There's even some places that use growth regulators to slow down the trees around power lines to reduce the amount of pruning. But ultimately, you the recommendations do involve, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the recommendations that we have created nowadays are being followed. Because it's a lot of times it sometimes just runs down the budget. What landscaper is going to do, they're just trying to meet the specs. Yes, there's a power line there, but these trees are small. Some people will view that way. Some people will do the proactive thing, is like, hey, the power lines are this high, let's plant a tree that matures at this height. Because there is sources out there, but it's essentially, you can provide a horse with water, but you can't force the horse to drink from the trough. So yes, they have evolved, but not everybody is going to do those recommendations. Does that kind of answer your question? It is kind of sad. But I know there is a push with power line companies to do better pruning. If you have a large tree, sometimes those pruning cuts are too far beyond, but at least they prune the tree rather than removing it. And sometimes those power lines are put after the tree has been planted. And if it's a really large tree, well, that tree was probably planted a long time ago. And again, nobody was considering it.
Okay. Well, it's 1 o'clock. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. No, it's been fun to
Yeah.
be here. I love the
Yeah.
questions. It's
It
one of
is-
the things I really love with having a science-based company is I love the curiosity. I love questions. I love it when we can find answers to questions, or at least be pointed in the right direction. And I'm always happy to help.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Sounds good. Take care. Thank you for
Thank
having me
you.
on.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.